because it is much more profitable to plant corn and soy, for example. That is what a vast majority of farmers are planting. Most farmers are losing money to try to do something alternative that is better for the soil, better for the environment, better for our health, but it's not better for their survival, for their business. You have the problems of kind of a free market fundamentalism paired with the kind of corrupt forces that are actually shaping that free market fundamentalism into something else.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo and Nate.
Today, our guest is Carmel Richardson, who's the 2021-2022 editorial fellow at the American Conservative. Most recently, she wrote the cover article for the American Conservative's July-August issue, which is about the American food system, and which hones in specifically on the use of seed oils, which is a topic that a lot of the right has grown interested in the last few years, and one that has even given rise to a subculture of people, including myself, who have waged a figurative jihad on hydrogenated oils. So thank you for joining us, Carmel.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Before we get to our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you would like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Carmel, you recently had the cover issue, as Marlo mentioned, for the American Conservative July-August issue on the topic of U.S. food policy and the issue of seed oils. Can you give our listeners just a basic background about the issue of seed oils and what you were talking about in your article, and then perhaps why conservatives in particular are so interested in the issue?
Yeah. So it's not something that maybe strikes you off the bat as a conservative issue, right? It's kind of crunchy, it's a little bit offbeat, but the seed oils are an important thing for us to be thinking about because number one, they're in everything, right? So, and this is something I cover in the article, but effectively, like 90% of our food production contains some of these seed oils, whether that's rapeseed oil, which is canola oil, or cottonseed oil, corn oil, et cetera, et cetera. These oils are prolific. And so the result of having these in so much of our food is that we not only have the health problems, which I think we should talk about, and that's the big reason that most people are talking about them. But the other side effect is that our food sources are very homogenized. So all that we're eating is kind of coming from a couple key ingredients, or those key ingredients are in so much of what we're eating that we are actually, like what we see as a diversity of food sources is actually like only a handful of ingredients that have just been repackaged in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. So as I argue in the piece, there are some real serious ramifications of that, again, for our health, but also for the way that our food chain works, our supply chain, and just for food and farming diversity.
You mentioned crunchy conservatives, which I love. And on the subject of, especially this was published in TAC, Rod Dreher's characterization of crunchy conservatives, which he actually wrote an entire book about. And I like that because, I first of all consider myself a crunchy conservative. And I think that the phenomena of seed oil disrespecters, especially, which is, that's the name of a Twitter account that I follow, but I think it encapsulates kind of this almost horseshoe theory of, on one end, conservatives, and Dreher talks about this in his book, who are health conscious, they're going to like local organic food co-ops, they're donning tote bags and wearing Birkenstocks. And obviously you have kind of those concerns among conservatives that are largely shared by, maybe on the other side of the horseshoe, some more lefty-leaning people who are showing up at those same co-ops. They're going to farms that offer regenerative farming practices, which actually is a farm that me and my husband go to as well to get all of our goods because it's all seed oil free. And it's like really funny to see and really kind of, I think this topic especially frames it really well, more than a lot of other subjects that are super divisive today, but just how much the two sides have in common when it comes to organic foods, seed oils, actually focusing on trying to patronize food sources that don't do damage to the environment, to animals, and aren't ultimately exploitative. So what are your thoughts on this growing subculture of right-wingers who are going seed oil free? It might just be restricted to Twitter, which is where I spend a lot of my time, admittedly. But I do think that there has been, there's definitely kind of a growing section of kind of the non-ideological conservative camp that have become kind of more sensitive to the seed oil issue and trying to be more health conscious.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I do think it's a good thing that we're becoming more health conscious. I think this should have been a conservative issue all along. And Rod, as you're right, kind of points that out, that this is actually very conservative to care about what we're eating, to care about the sources of what we're eating. And as you mentioned, like seed oil free farming is a really good example of why this matters, because it's not just that we have canola oil in your French fries at McDonald's or whatever. Like we all kind of know if we're eating something like that, we know it's not good for us. But it's also like the way that canola oil is produced, you have some of the waste product is turned into feed for animals. And so that's, for example, how a lot of cows are feed finished. And so even if it says like grass fed, that doesn't necessarily mean that that cow has eaten grass for his whole life. He's usually finished on this kind of seed cakey grain mixture, which is a byproduct of seed oils. So if they're not good for us, avoiding them becomes like this quite a process really to kind of get around the food chain as it's currently set up. But I do think it is a conservative issue, like I said, just because we care about the whole human being and we care about what is good for the family. We talk a lot about fertility, for example. That's something that seed oils can affect. So if we care about the whole human being, if we care about what is good for the environment, this kind of crunchiness, maybe it's not trending in the GOP broadly the way that it is in the very online right. But I think that it's a good direction that we're taking, and we should keep going down it because it affects the whole human being. It affects a lot more than just, I guess, our aesthetic, which is maybe one of the reasons that people have not taken it more seriously.
It's funny. I'm also someone who self-identifies, I guess, as a crunchy con. So I guess for some reason, this is a crunchy conservative podcast today. Less so with the seed oil issue, which I've just paid less attention to than I think you two. But I'm on the record as being conservatism's resident greenie. I've written a lot about environmentalism and conservation, et cetera. To me, it seems obvious that issue would be something conservatives care about. I mean, conservation is quite literally just conservatism. But it hasn't been for a while. And I think, this was something Marlo was just touching on, the interest in sort of healthy organic foods, localism, co-ops, et cetera. That's something that it seems like it's making a resurgence in conservatism, and particularly among young conservatives. The interests in these sort of long neglected issues, health, environmentalism, getting back in touch with sort of local crunchy communities. It's something that it seems like, admittedly within our relatively insular sphere of young conservatives who are politically engaged, who are writers, intellectuals, et cetera, there is a new interest for it that is in stark contrast to a lot of older conservatives, or at least the sort of conservative movement self-conception for the last couple of decades. I wonder why, Carmel, I don't know how much you've sort of thought about the broader issue of crunchy conservatism, but seed oils is obviously a big part of this. Why are young conservatives in particular attracted to these issues in a way that, conservatives in a previous generation wouldn't have been?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think you're right that it is a generational divide. I have been doing my best to convince my parents of the dangers of seed oils, but it's a slow process. Yeah, so I agree. I don't know that I know what the main difference is, but I can say I think a big difference is just kind of it seems to be another ramification of the divide between, I hesitate to say boomers, but kind of the boomer generation, which I characterize as being very like laissez-faire, if I send my kid to a good public school, for example, things will probably hopefully turn out well. And then they don't turn out well, and they didn't. And why is that? So I think our generation has definitely been more reactive to that. We're thinking a lot more seriously. We see that, so many of the kids that we maybe graduated high school with have turned out they're now transgender or whatever. And we're like, there are serious problems here. We need to be actively working against them. And so I think the crunchiness is a part of that, where we're not just kind of floating along and saying, well, if it's a good school, if it's like, fairly healthy food, if Harvard tells me to eat it, it's probably okay. We're thinking a lot more deeply about it. And I think alongside that is a lot more distrust of institutions, including, health institutions, especially since 2020.
In your piece, you talk about and kind of framing this in its economic kind of terms of seed oil production and how it basically fueled a part of the Canadian economy, this multi-billion-dollar seed oil production industry. And you also, you mentioned more recently how the conflict in Ukraine is contributing to maybe some of the supply chain issues we're seeing in seed oil production. Could you talk about, and maybe, in reference to your piece, but also elsewhere, just some of the different variables and economic influences and lobbying influences that have gone into the proliferation of seed oils? I know like Kate Shanahan, who is like the patron saint of the seed oil free communities, I guess. And, she wrote Deep Nutrition years ago. We have a copy of it at our house and frequently reference it. But she talks about how I think it's the American Heart Association was so heavily influenced by, lobbyists for the seed oil industry, or there was, influence there that kind of caused them to fine tune their health recommendations to make it favorable to seed oils rather than other fats. And there was a period of American history where like butter was heavily demonized, and anything that had fat in it would make you fat was the understanding. And, anyone who kind of does some research on that topic and just the nutrition behind it and maybe reads Kate Shanahan's book knows that fat shouldn't be vilified. Some fats should. The one, seed oil and hydrogenated oils probably should be. But can you talk about like some of the players and the constituents and the people or the industries that want seed oils to become or to stay the norm out of pure self-interest and financial incentive?
Yeah. So I think a big part of it is the starting point, right? Which is Procter and Gamble were the first had the first major advertising campaign just in general, right? For like a food advertising, it was like a multi-billion-dollar campaign back in the early 1900s. And this was before food labels were regulated, so they could effectively say whatever they want. And what they said was vegetable oils are more healthy for you than butter. And this is because they had a new product to sell, and that product was Crisco. And so they were passing out, Crisco cookbooks in the streets, or like Crisco fried donuts. if a woman bought a can of Crisco, she would get a cookbook that had all of these recipes that used Crisco in place of butter. So there was this initial push to use, and that's a hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is basically the worst kind. So there's an initial push to use these things before we even really know what we're dealing with. And then it becomes so much a part of the, I guess, public food consciousness, you could say, that it's just ingrained, and it's hard to kind of go back from that. And especially what's interesting to me is that these products they're very plastic, right? Not in the sense of like they're synthetic, they're bad for you. They are, but they're also very like flexible. You can use them for multiple purposes and in a variety of ways. And they have very neutral flavors. So they effectively they're really good players for all kinds of foods we've developed that we really couldn't have developed without vegetable oils, particularly hydrogenated vegetable oils. So once you kind of have that in your food consciousness, I guess I'll just keep working with that, then it's hard to pull it out. And so what happened was then you have Fred Kummerow, who is the German biochemist, who kind of started looking into the connection between trans fats and heart disease. And that's part of the problem is trans fats. And they're particularly high in hydrogenated vegetable oils. And so he was lobbying the FDA for years to say, hey, we need to get rid of trans fats. And he was looking into this in 1955. Trans fats were not banned by the FDA until 2015, and that ban did not go into effect in 2018. So it was a long time coming. And I think part of that was because those hydrogenated oils were so entrenched in food product by the time people started pushing back on it, that it's really hard to take that out. You have to say, oh, we're no longer going to have deep fried chicken, for example, unless we go back to beef tallow, which costs a lot more. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also, there's a little bit more of a surreptitious element. And this is where it just gets murky. But there was lobbying on behalf of the FDA. The FDA was requiring vegetable oil to have, or French dressing to have like 30% vegetable oil for a lot of years. And they were requiring, they have really stringent requirements on infant formula. And it's to the point that you have to use vegetable oil even if it's not necessarily required. And that part is, like I say, a little bit hazier. We're not really sure why that has been, but we do know that their seed oil farmers, soybean farmers, for example, donate a lot to the AHA. They do have significant lobbying in Congress. And so there's not a direct line there, but there are certainly some fishy implications.
So I'm approaching this issue from a place of extreme ignorance, but that's probably helpful because at least a segment of our listeners, I'm sure, aren't super familiar with the seed oil discourse. So as someone who isn't an expert on the issue, but is interested in it, I know people who are nutritionists and who work in the nutrition industry. And I'm thinking in particular of someone I know who just finished her master's in nutrition and now works in a hospital. And she's conservative leaning, but, broadly apolitical and isn't really aware of the kind of the seed oil discourse in our circles. And I was asking her about it because I'm curious. And what she was saying, and something that I've heard from a couple other folks as well, is that it's less that seed oils specifically are bad for you and more that they are often in foods that are bad for you for any number of other reasons. And that seed oils are essentially associated with unhealthy outcomes because they're often in processed foods or foods that have other things that are unhealthy, but that there's less substantive evidence for the fact that seed oils specifically are bad for you. I'm curious. I mean, this is, again, as someone I'm speaking to someone who obviously knows what she's talking about, but I don't know the science. Are there sort of substantive studies to show that seed oils specifically are bad for you? Or is it more just that they are associated with other things that are bad?
I would say it's both. Obviously, those other things are bad for you. And highly processed food comes with a litany of problems. But there are studies specifically for seed oils. And the one I think that is best is this one that was done in Norway. And effectively, they studied this group of men. It was like over 9,000 men who were in mental institutions, which it's kind of a morbid setting, but it's very useful because in those institutions, you can track precisely what someone's eating. And so I think that study was probably the most, I'm sorry, it was not in Norway, it was in Minnesota, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. I think that's the most helpful because what they did was they tracked the diet of these people and they found that it covered a broad age range. It covered, like I said, 9,400 participants. And they found that the group that was eating, they had one group eating vegetable oil and the other group was eating animal fats. And they found that the people who were consuming vegetable oil and trying to control all the other variables as much as possible, it's difficult with food. They found that the people who were consuming vegetable oil, the differences in cholesterol were not any different from what other scientists have found, right? There was higher cholesterol in those consuming saturated fats versus those consuming the unsaturated fats or the vegetable oils. But the people who were consuming the vegetable oils actually had more incidences of heart disease and heart problems. And the people who were consuming saturated fats were having less instances. So it turns out that I think that study really demonstrates that the problem is not really the cholesterol, which is a lot of times what we're pointed to, but with the actual fats themselves. And because there were so many other points that were controlled in that study, I think it's a pretty good look at it. Obviously, there's more that can be done, and there are more questions there. And I'm not a nutritionist. I think that study was pretty convincing to me.
Something that actually, before we hopped on to record this episode, my colleague Tom, who wrote, he helps out with production on the podcast. I gave him my seed oil spiel basically, and he mentioned that he's been reading labels now. And this morning he was reading the back of like a granola bar label and saw that there were seed oils in it. And it's interesting, like hearing that, because I know so many people who, once they hear about the presence of seed oil in everything, and you've mentioned this, I mean, it's used in the flexibility of its usage. It's in everything from food to shampoos to baby formula. So it is in, just about everything we eat, and it's extremely hard to find healthy alternatives. People me and my husband were very fortunate where like we go out to a farm in like the middle of Pennsylvania and get our food from there, because they use regenerative farming practices, and it's, ethically sourced, and we trust their food production, and it's seed oil free. But we realize that most Americans simply do not have the time or maybe the money to be able to afford food that isn't heavily processed like that, or includes seed oils. It's so hard to find. I mean, even healthy, options that seem like they'd be healthy are sometimes laced in seed oils, canola oils. I've even seen organic foods advertise themselves as being organic, but with like organic canola oil in them. So you go to Whole Foods and you're going to come across seed oils anyways, no matter how healthy you're trying to be. And it does take a lot of time and resources and energy to be able to kind of work around just the presence of those ingredients in everything we consume. So it does kind of present, I guess, a class issue in a way that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on. Is how can Americans, how can we be understanding of the fact that readily accessible food, not even just fast food, which obviously is the simplest option to refer to, but literally everything else we come across in grocery stores is just much more readily available, especially if you're making food for your family, or you're, a two income household where both parents are working, or maybe you're a single mother. Just being conscious of those, those different dynamics that may inhibit the ability to actually like go free of seed oils, which it obviously is the healthiest option to do because it is terrible for your body. But what are your thoughts on kind of, I guess, the class contours of the issue, and how, like, I'm sure the US government is not interested in just cutting seed oil production because it's such a lucrative industry. So what are your thoughts on kind of the concept of class as it fits into this discussion?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because it does tend to break down along the lines of who can afford to live a seed oil free lifestyle, and who can afford to gain that knowledge, right? Usually the people I find who are aware of these things are young, but also, educated, upper middle class. I'm not talking about seed oils with the homeless man. He doesn't care. So yeah, it presents a real difficulty because, like I said, it's hard to work around the way that our food system operates. And yeah, it's expensive. So solutions, yeah, I don't really have any easy solutions or viable ones, I guess, things that seem like likely to happen. I do think, as with anything, that the conversation has to start with the culture. So if we're changing the conversation on these things, if we're talking about it, if we are implanting some of these ideas in people's minds and making it more of a mainstream issue, making it, for example, I have a friend who likes to call fast food restaurants and complain about the presence of seed oils in the foods. Is he going to change it? Probably not. But things like that start to push, fast food restaurants to say, oh, there's beginning to be a percentage of my customers that care that, for example, Chick-fil-A fries in peanut oil versus other oils, or cares that McDonald's used to use beef tallow for French fries and wants it to be that way again. If we as consumers can kind of push back in that direction, if there's a critical minority to say, hey, we care about these things, we want food that is a little bit healthier, even if it's still fast food and it's still cheap and it's still not the best thing for us. I think those are small ways that we can kind of move the needle toward a healthier society. And I think, yeah, the bigger the bigger task would be kind of changing some of these FDA regulations and making that a priority as voters, which, again, viable option. I don't see that as being one of them, but a girl can dream, I guess.
It seems like something that we've sort of been implicitly touching on is that there are certain sort of anti-capitalist implications to some of this discussion. And this is something that I have also it's a conclusion that I've also arrived at in writing about the environment and conservation. Like, in contrast to, I think, a lot of conservatives, like, I actually think climate change is a big deal, but that issue and just the broader issues of environmental degradation and conservation expose limits to, I think, sort of free market thinking. It's not to say that decentralized economies aren't a good, generally speaking, or that socialism is a good answer, but it's also that the kind of worship of market mechanisms at any cost, even at the expense of these massive concentrations of economic power that clearly don't have the nation's best interests at heart, which characterized a previous generation of conservative thinking on economics, has severe limitations. And in the seed oil sort of issues that we're talking about, it's both the class stuff that you and Marlo were just discussing, but also obviously the power of large, powerful economic concentrations of power to lobby organizations that are supposed to be performing one function, which is keeping us healthy, and completely corrupt and pervert their functions in ways that make it difficult to trust a lot of our institutions. That's anyone who sort of spends time in intellectual conservative circles in DC is familiar with this sort of skepticism of what is broadly called free market fundamentalism. But I wonder if, this is kind of an interesting aspect of it that I think is really important, but isn't discussed quite enough, which is the sort of nutrition side of it. But it seems like it's part of this larger kind of sense that, like, the sort of free market economic thinking of the 1990s, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, is sort of hollow or has severe limitations. And I wonder how the kind of seed oil and nutrition discussion slots into that in your kind of writing about it. Yeah,
I think I would say that it seems to me there's a broad spectrum between the free market fundamentalism and, full-on socialism on the other end, which I think you're saying. The seed oils in particular just highlight to me the fact that it's not like what we're seeing is not just a product of free market fundamentalism. It is actually, there's a lot of lobbying on behalf of, for example, the big four meat farmers. So it's not really just straight capitalism, even as we see it. So to say that the solution to that is, some kind of government intervention in the opposite direction, I think is just to recognize reality. There is a lot of corruption in the food industry. And yeah, the main players are few and very large. So one of the things I talk about is kind of the homogenization of small farms as a result of this kind of efficiency focus in our food, because it is much more profitable to plant corn and soy, for example. That is what, 90% of a vast majority of farmers are planting. And it really is not only not profitable, but actually most farmers are losing money to try to do something alternative that is better for the soil, better for the environment, better for our health, but it's not better for their survival, for their business. So it is, I think it's both, and you have the problems of kind of a free market fundamentalism paired with the kind of corrupt forces that are actually shaping that free market fundamentalism into something else, which I think, we have asked for that in some sense, but it's also, there is certainly some, what is the word? The forces of these bigger four in the meat industry, or like these bigger forces at the upper ends of agriculture production are consolidating. And I think we can't ignore that.
Right. And to your point, Carmel, it's not necessarily, as you were saying, and I obviously agree, it's not necessarily that something like socialism or this massive new sort of government regulatory apparatus is the solution. I think at least partially, it's more sort of a shift in tone among a lot of the young conservatives we know, where there was a period of time where sort of economic efficiency was worshipped, right, among conservatives. And there were sort of long screeds written about how awesome it is that you can get something cheaper at the grocery store, or it's more available or it's more abundant, et cetera. And it seems like the seed oil discourse is part of a shift away from that, where there's an understanding that, particularly in the example of seed oils, that economic efficiency in this case and sort of cost-cutting measures actually has led to worse health outcomes for people. And that doesn't necessarily come with a prescriptive remedy that militates in favor of government or more government or whatever, but it's a sort of an understanding that economic efficiency isn't always the be-all, end-all of politics. And actually it has, problems sometimes. And I think that, to me, that's where I see a lot of the kind of localism, the interest in local farming, and the alienation from sort of big corporations that might have been lauded by a previous generation of conservatives manifest. It's more of a sense of not necessarily that government should be doing something, but just that markets aren't necessarily a deity to be worshipped. Anyways, does that make sense sort of in terms of where the seed oil discourse fits in?
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess one recent subject that also ties into all of this that I'd be interested in hearing, and you talk about this in your piece, but I think it'll be especially interesting for listeners to hear, and I think this also loops into what Nate was saying, was the baby formula shortage and the presence of seed oils, of course, in baby food, while there are alternatives in European brands that do not have these ingredients in them. Could you talk a little bit about that issue first off, and perhaps also how it still is extremely difficult to get those better brands circulated in the US because of kind of the concentration of some of the baby formula brands that are prevalent at US stores. I think there's a handful of them that basically comprise the baby formula industry. And maybe there are some contours there also between how regulation and on behalf of some American bureaucracies and health bureaucracies can actually hurt health outcomes because they're preventing the circulation of actually healthier brands that do not have the presence of these seed oils.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're talking about is it's a little bit, in effect, protectionist of the U.S. formula industry, which is interesting to me. I won't get into that. But what's happened is our regulation on baby formulas is very stringent, as with all things baby, as I have recently discovered, having my first daughter. But what is the effect of that is that the ingredients that are in these things are actually not, they're not good for infants. And obviously it's kind of a conundrum because there are a lot of things that infants shouldn't be consuming. And, I'll touch on the third rail of motherhood and say, I think that nothing is better for a baby than breastfeeding. But for the mother who can't do that, there's really not any good option in American brands. And so a lot of women look to these European brands, and it's kind of a black market, if you will, of women ordering from overseas because the way that Europe regulates infant formula is just better than what we do. Things that they keep out, the things that they allow in are superior. And there was, as I talk about in the article, there was a group in San Francisco, two moms who started a company, and they were trying to make what would have been the American European infant formula. And it was very crunchy. I don't know for sure that the first version did not have vegetable oil in it. I will say that because the ingredients, we can't find them anymore. But what I do know is that it was a much cleaner formula as far as ingredients that they had to keep out. And I won't bore you with all of those details, but what effectively happened was they were shut down by the FDA because they weren't stringent enough in their production. And I say stringent only in terms of what the FDA requires, which is not actually the same as what is healthy. And so when they reproduced their new formula, it contains a lot of these same chemicals that most crunchy moms are complaining about. And so it's just kind of amusing that what is supposed to be protecting us, what is supposed to be protecting infants, is actually, I would say, harming them, not in a immediately visible way, but in a long-term healthy way. We're being harmed. So I don't know how we get around that as far as having European standards for our formula. It would require a lot of change at an institutional level, which is not expected.
In terms of the sort of political implications of this issue, I think you were right to point out earlier in the podcast that the salience of seed oils specifically might not be a winning electoral message. I don't know how many people you're going to turn out on like stump speeches about seed oil necessarily. A lot of our friends would show up, but I don't think that it's enough to put together like a winning electoral coalition. But nutrition more broadly, I think, has been a political issue. The content of school lunches, for example, was an issue in the Bush era, and Michelle Obama's sort of big crusade was nutrition. It seems like that is something that is easily understandable as a political message, and also obviously permeates everyone's lives, particularly working and middle class people. Nutrition matters. It's something that you can talk about, that they understand. And it's a way to make people's lives better, which I think ultimately is what politicians should be seeking to do, ideally. I wonder if there's, it's not something that you hear Republicans talk about very much. And I wonder if there is sort of a broader conservative nutrition agenda that conservatives could be talking about and running on. Seed oils would ostensibly be a part of that, but it would probably be a broader kind of discussion. But as someone who's written about that, what would you like to see the kind of political conservative nutritionist agenda actually look like?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think like the one idea that comes to mind is kind of following the Michelle Obama vein and tying it to school lunches, because that's something that is directly related to politics, and it's something that politics actually affects, right? We don't want to get into the realm of politicians saying, oh, vote for me if you don't like hamburgers or, whatever. It can get really weird really quickly. And voting on our food choices is not really a place that I see this going. But I think school lunches, I think, FDA regulations, I think you can tie that to the broader administrative state and say, hey, we're interested in cutting back some of these bad regulations. There are a lot of ways that conservatives would be very comfortable approaching this that would do both things. It would be good for them electorally, and it would also be good for us healthfully and in kind of combating this bad science.
Great. Well, we are out of time, but thanks again for joining us, Carmel. It was really, really interesting and an underrated subject we covered today. If people want to read more from you, where can they find you?
Yep, I am at The American Conservative. I'm a contributing editor, and I'm also on Twitter, and that is at Carmel Elizabeth.
Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.